Hi, everybody, and welcome back. I'm Todd Hasak-Lowy, reading from We Are Power, How Nonviolent Activism Changes the World. Trying a new camera angle today. This is part 2 of second chapter of the book, Alice Paul and Votes for Women. Here we go. Alice Paul and 4 well-connected suffragists next managed to arrange a meeting with President Wilson. The president, 30 years older than Paul and a one-time college professor, arranged 5 seats in a semicircle facing his chair in the Oval Office, as if he intended to hold class. But it was Paul who would soon teach him a lesson. Suffrage is, quote, the paramount issue of the day, Paul told the president. Wilson claimed he had no opinion on the matter. He then changed the subject to various issues he was eager to work with Congress on. Currency revision and tariff reform. The president likely expected the meeting to end soon, the bothersome suffragists grateful he had agreed to meet with them at all. Rather than leave, Paul said, "But Mr. President, do you not understand that the administration has no right to legislate for currency, tariff, or any other reform without first getting the consent of women?" Paul's words bluntly explained to the president why she described her cause as paramount to begin with. In her eyes, the American government was illegitimate as long as half its adult population was barred from election. Paul's readiness for confrontation during her very first meeting with the president shows how this young suffragist was anything but meek. Paul believed that winning President Wilson's support for a constitutional amendment was the key to its success, and she and her followers would employ a variety of methods in the coming years to persuade him. They held more parades and sent group after group to lobby Wilson and his Democratic counterparts who were a majority in Congress. When this didn't work, these women formed their own political party. The National Women's Party, NWP, campaigned against Democrats in those states where women could already vote in order to punish them for failing to support a national amendment. And when all these tactics failed to bring results, the Silent Sentinels were born. For the first few months of 1917, the Sentinels picketed the White House without incident. The tactic won them steady publicity, and they soon became a tourist attraction for those visiting the nation's capital. The president took to nodding, smiling, waving, or tipping his hat when passing them each day. Otherwise, he ignored them. To be fair, there was something even bigger, stubbornly demanding Wilson's attention at this time. World War I. The United States entered the war on April 6, 1917. As is almost always the case during wartime, the public and press called for everyone, suffragists included, to support the war effort and put everything else on hold. And the more compliant NAWSA did just that, with their leader, Carrie Chapman Catt, writing to Wilson that, quote, "It seemed to us only fair to wait yet a while longer and not press for suffrage during this extraordinary session." But those aligned with Alice Paul refused such obedience because they viewed the president's rationale for joining the war as hypocritical. President Wilson promised the United States would make the world, quote, "safe for democracy." But how could the United States champion democracy abroad if back home its own democracy excluded every other person of voting age? Not only did the Sentinels remain by the White House gates, the language of their banners now directly challenged the president's reasoning for the war. "Democracy must begin at home," one read. From the beginning of the pickets, Paul and the Sentinels regularly changed the banner's messages in order to guarantee steady publicity. Just changing the words was good, but employing bolder and bolder language in order to escalate the confrontation was even better. On June 20th, the day a group of Russian allies visited the White House, the Sentinels took the showdown between themselves and the president to a new level. As the Russians drove through the gate, Lucy Burns and Dora Lewis held aloft a banner addressed to the diplomats. And it said, "President Wilson and Envoy Root are deceiving Russia. We women of America tell you that America is not a democracy. 20 million American women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of their national enfranchisement. Help us make our government really free. Tell our government that it must liberate its people before it can claim free Russia as an ally. The assembled crowd reacted angrily to what they viewed as a deeply unpatriotic act. One man tore part of the banner from its frame, and then another leapt forward to finish the job, ripping what was left to shreds. Burns and Lewis continued standing with nothing but wooden poles in their hands. As planned, the incident got more attention in the press than the actual visit of the Russians to the White House. The next morning, the picketers returned with a duplicate version of the Russian banner and were greeted by a much larger, even angrier crowd. Some boys destroyed the banner before the eyes of passive policemen. More sentinels followed with other banners, including Hazel Hunkin's, bearing a message that read, "We demand democracy and self-government in our own land." Hunkins was spat at, her banner grabbed and trampled on. Hunkins was wrestled to the sidewalk, but as one historian put it, she, quote, countered her instincts to fight back. Hunkins herself wrote to her mother that she responded as Alice Paul had instructed her to, like, quote, a non-resistant pacifist and not an offender in any way. After over half a year of the Sentinels picketing undisturbed, Major Raymond Pullman, Washington, D.C.'s chief of police, suddenly informed them that they would be arrested if they continued. Why has picketing suddenly become illegal? Paul asked. Our lawyers have assured us all along that picketing was legal. Certainly it is as legal in June as in January. Pullman repeated his warning. The picketing will go on as usual, Paul replied. Paul knew that technically the law was on their side, but she understood that in practice picketing would now be treated as civil disobedience, as a deliberate violation of police orders. Not a single suffragist had been arrested since Paul's return to the United States. Would she ask her fellow activists to sacrifice their personal freedom for an even greater one? On June 22nd, Mabel Vernon, Lucy Burns, and Catherine Morey all walked separately to the White House. None of them had exited Cameron House with a banner, though Vernon had carried out a box with her. When the three of them eventually met up at the East Gate, Vernon opened the box and handed the other two its contents, a banner, this one containing Wilson's own words. We shall fight for the things we have always held nearest to our hearts. For democracy, for the right to those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own government. And here we see also a picture of some police tearing away banners from suffragists as people look on. After insulting him and essentially calling him a liar the day before, the suffragists now turned the president's language against him. The three police present were dumbfounded. Them's the president's own words, one said. The police had clear orders to arrest any picketers, but how could quoting Wilson himself possibly be unlawful? The confused trio eventually concluded that they had no choice but to act on the commands they were given. Burns and Morey refused to surrender their banner and were arrested. The charge? Obstructing traffic. Those first charges against Burns and Morey were dropped, but almost a week later, 6 suffragists were brought to court under the same bogus charges. They were each fined $25. But the women refused to pay and publicly rejected the court's unjust verdict. Not $1 of your fine shall we pay, the 6 said. To pay a fine would be an admission of guilt. We are innocent. The judge sent them off to serve 3 days in the district jail, making them the first American women to go to prison for demanding the right to vote. And so the summer of 1917 ushered in a new routine. Pickets, arrests, trials, and jail sentences. The NWP, relying on the power of its numbers, showed it had no shortage of banners to display or women to send to prison. Again and again, the convicted suffragists used the courtroom as an opportunity to call out the true reason for their arrests. Quote, "We know full well," said Mrs. John Rogers, Jr., a direct descendant of Roger Sherman, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, "that we stand here because the President of the United States refuses to give liberty to American women." I want to note here, you may have noticed, the person who said this, her name was Mrs. John Rogers, Jr. If you want to get a sense for just how much history has typically been about men and how much women have been viewed as associated only with men, and that's their status and their identity. I could not find this woman's name anywhere. She was always identified as Mrs. John Rogers. In mid-July, 16 suffragists were sentenced to 60 days in the Occoquan workhouse, where the women found rat-infested cells and a menu of inedible foods, stale bread, sour soup, and rotten meat. Worms riddled every dish. Word leaked out about the terrible conditions under which the jailed sentinels were kept, and only after 3 days Wilson himself pardoned the new inmates. It appeared that future picketers might not be arrested at all, but the newly freed suffragists received this good news around the same time they got an ominous warning from the highly feared superintendent of Occoquan, Raymond Whitaker. The next lot of women who come here won't be treated with the same consideration that these women were. The first imprisonments in Occoquan gave the suffragists another wave of sympathetic publicity and brought about positive action in Congress. The Senate Women's Suffrage Committee, whose task it was to consider and possibly vote on the Anthony Amendment, issued its first favorable report not long after some of its members visited the prisoners there. The House of Representatives finally set up a similar committee of its own. The NWP strategy seemed to be getting results, and so on Friday, August 10th, the Sentinels chose to escalate their confrontation between themselves and the president yet again. Lucy Burns brought a new banner to the White House. Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten how you sympathized with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Kaiser was the title of the enemy German leader, making this banner the most scandalous yet and showing that these activists, however nonviolent, weren't about to pull any punches. A man grabbed Burns' banner and ran off, but otherwise police kept order at the scene. On Monday, 3 more Kaiser banners were taken to the White House gates. All were torn down. The following day, August 14th, the picketers couldn't even reach 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The furious crowd, heavily populated with servicemen and numbering at least 1,000, attacked NWP headquarters, where they destroyed every banner they could get their hand on. After locking the doors to Cameron House, Lucy Burns, Virginia Arnold, and Elizabeth Stuyvesant grabbed some remaining banners, ran up to the 2nd and 3rd floors, and hung them from the balconies. In response, 3 sailors found a ladder in an adjacent theater, climbed to the 2nd floor balcony, and tore them down. When Burns went out to the balcony, she was nearly pulled over the railing, struggling for her life against these sailors as the transfixed crowd watched from below. A sailor punched one young suffragist right in the face. A violent mob pelted the headquarters with eggs, tomatoes, and stones. A bullet even shot through the building. As afternoon turned to evening, the police, who had looked on idly for hours, finally stepped in and regained order. The following day, Paul joined the pickets, which once more turned violent. She was knocked down 3 times and dragged 30 feet along the pavement by a sailor. Other sentinels were attacked as well. The police went back and forth between keeping order and joining the attackers. By midweek, approximately 150 banners had been seized or destroyed. Worse yet, the women were informed that if they continued picketing, the arrests would begin again. Alice Paul faced a difficult decision. On the one hand, she believed that it was necessary to keep pressure on President Wilson. On the other, it was impossible to ignore the fact that this recent escalation had cost them some goodwill. The Sentinels' quote, treasonous acts were now turning public opinion against them. Despite this, the confrontational pickets continued, as did the arrests and trips to jail. As summer turned to fall in 1917, Paul understood that only the women's ongoing suffering could garner sympathy and advance the cause. But not just anyone's sacrifice would be enough at this stage. It was time for another escalation. In regular wars, generals remain safe, while foot soldiers trade shots and risk their lives on the front lines miles away. But in a nonviolent struggle, things work differently. Here the leader herself would have to face danger directly if she were to challenge power. And this is also something that we're going to see over and over again. Martin Luther King Jr. famously went to prison during the Birmingham campaign. Cesar Chavez also joined in marches and did other things to put himself in danger. The head of the NWP decided that it was time for her to go to prison. On October 20th, Paul carried a banner bearing the words of the president once again, and this is the banner that was discussed at the opening of this chapter. The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there can be but one choice. We have made it. She was arrested and given a 7-month sentence. Before this, no suffragist had been sentenced to more than 60 days. In prison, Paul began a hunger strike. If each and every nonviolent tactic exists somewhere along a spectrum from easy and safe on one end to difficult and dangerous on the other, then hunger striking lies at the far edge of the difficult, dangerous end. This most extreme tactic demands of the activist a willingness to suffer immensely and even risk her life. Paul had gone on a hunger strike back in England, so she knew full well the torment for which she was volunteering. In 1909, after first using the tactic, she had written in a letter to her mother, "I shall never go on a hunger strike again." As had been the case in England, it was likely the American authorities would respond by force-feeding her, since they could not afford to have a prisoner die of starvation while in their custody. And the American force feedings would turn out to be even worse than those of the British, since here it was performed 3 times a day. Back in England, they did it only twice. Pauls responded by demanding political prisoner status, claiming that she was unfairly arrested because of her political protest against an unfair government, and not because she broke any laws. Not content with force-feeding her, Paul's jailers soon placed her on a stretcher and carried her to the psychiatric ward where no one, not even her lawyer, could visit her. There Paul was checked regularly by a Dr. J.A. Gannon in order to determine if she was in fact mentally ill. If Gannon settled on a diagnosis of insanity, he could transfer her to St. Elizabeth's, a government-run insane asylum where she might be held indefinitely, well beyond the duration of her sentence. 100 years ago, quote, difficult but otherwise sane women were often sent to asylums to be isolated and thus silenced. In such a place, Paul would be removed from the legal system altogether and rendered utterly powerless. And the optimism Paul had that Gannon was a regular doctor concerned only with his patient's well-being was dashed when he told her, "I will show you who rules this place." In order to weaken her further, boards were nailed over the windows. Throughout the night, a nurse woke her each hour by shining a bright light in her face, leading to sleep deprivation, a classic torture technique. Quote, "I believe I have never in my life before feared anything or any human being," Paul said later, "but I confess I was afraid of Dr. Gannon." Despite all this, Paul never broke. Meanwhile, the Sentinels continued their protests. Before her arrest, Paul had planned to increase the picketing in order to send women to prison, quote, "in such numbers that the government cannot handle the situation." Again, this is a technique we will see over and over again, most clearly in Birmingham in the next chapter about the civil rights movement. Instead of a handful of women, dozens of suffragists, intentionally recruited from all across the country so that news of their treatment would reach far and wide, stood at the White House gates and were soon arrested. Just as in a traditional war in which the side with more soldiers often prevails, the suffragists were now employing their abundant numbers with an eye on exhausting their opponents. Only this time around, the battlefields were the gates of the White House, the courts of Washington, D.C., and the jails and prisons surrounding it. The government had plenty of experience commanding a regular army, but the NWP showed that it had the organization, the resources, and above all, the committed soldiers to successfully wage this unconventional war on its own terms. Here we see a picture of Lucy Burns, and it's noted in the caption that she spent more time in prison than any other suffragist during this time. This is a picture of her in 1917 in the Occoquan workhouse, which we're going to revisit in a moment. A perplexed judge freed the first wave of women brought to his court, but when most of them returned after being arrested again just a few days later, he began handing out sentences. The 31 convicted women were supposed to be sent to the district jail, but their final destination turned out to be Occoquan instead. The women arrived there late in the evening on November 17th. A couple hours after their arrival, while the new inmates were waiting in a holding room, a furious Superintendent Whitaker, with his little eyes blazing, burst in. When Dora Lewis, acting as spokeswoman for the group, informed Whitaker that they wanted political status, he told her, "Shut up, sit down." When she did not, he ordered 2 guards to take her away. Whitaker was about to act on the threat he had made with the women months earlier. Moments later, the room filled with men, some not even in uniform, wielding clubs. Women were dragged and tossed into small, dark, dank cells. Dorothy Day was thrown down twice over an iron bench. Dora Lewis was knocked unconscious. Alice Kosu suffered a heart attack, but wasn't attended to for hours. The women were threatened with straitjackets and gags. Others were beaten and choked. When Lucy Burns began calling out the names of each woman to make sure they were okay, she was handcuffed to the bars of her cell, her arms held well above her head for hours. Whitaker was overheard saying that Lewis and Burns should be sent to solitary for life, if not killed. The women began a hunger strike of their own the next day. In response, the superintendent moved the inmates from room to room in apparent random order so that they might succumb to disorientation. Forced feedings followed. Soon news of the women's treatment began leaking out. On November 23rd, at a hearing about the legality of sending the suffragists to Occoquan in the first place, the weakened prisoners, some of whom who hadn't eaten for days, were presented to a concerned judge and observed by alarmed members of the press. The judge had them transferred to the district jail, where Paul remained on hunger strike. Thanks to the hard work of her lawyer, she had recently been released from the psychiatric ward and placed in the prison hospital. Within days of the women's transfer to the district jail, an unexpected visitor came to see Alice Paul. He was let into her room at 9 p.m., even though official visiting hours were long since over. The visitor was the journalist David Lawrence, a close friend of Woodrow Wilson, whom Lawrence first got to know as a student back at Princeton. Lawrence claimed to have had come on his own and not at the request of the administration, but it appears he was in fact there to negotiate with Paul on behalf of the president himself. They spoke for 2 hours in her room. Lawrence asked if the suffragists intended to resume their picketing. Paul responded that this would, quote, depend upon the attitude the administration and Congress seemed to be taking toward the federal amendment. Lawrence next addressed the matter of the 30 or so hunger strikers who were still demanding political prisoner status. Lawrence told her that it would be, quote, the easiest thing in the world for the administration to grant them such status. They could be moved to, quote, a fine house in Washington and be given the best of food. The only problem with this idea was that it might encourage other Americans who opposed America's entrance into the war to demand the same. This could not be permitted, and therefore, quote, it would be easier to give you the suffrage amendment than to treat you as political prisoners. As such, Lawrence informed Paul that the president would, quote, make it known to the leaders of Congress that he wanted it passed and would see that it passed. Instead of claiming he took orders from the party, as he had done earlier, President Wilson was now ready to act on his authority as the most powerful man in the American government. Lawrence said that the suffrage bill would be taken up soon, but it might take 2 sessions of Congress before it went through both houses. Negotiating forcefully, despite almost certainly being bedridden as well, Paul told Lawrence that the NWP would not be satisfied with that timetable. The visitor left. On November 27th and 28th, all the suffragists, including Paul herself, were suddenly released with no explanation. The recently freed Paul, who hadn't eaten voluntarily for 3 weeks, said, "We are put out of jail as we were put into jail, at the whim of the government. They tried to terrorize and suppress us. They could not, so they freed us." This conversation, the freeing of the jailed sentinels, and most of all, Wilson's decision to publicly support the Anthony Amendment demonstrated the power the, quote, weak actually possess. These suffragists were able to perform what scholars of nonviolence call political jujitsu. Jiu-jitsu is a form of martial arts designed around the idea that a smaller, weaker opponent with the proper technique can in fact defeat a bigger, stronger opponent by using their opponent's great, unruly force against them to throw them off balance. The government had the authority to arrest and jail these women. It even had the power to restrain them physically and force-feed them. But the suffragists turned the government's tactics against them. With each application of their power, the police, the judges, the politicians, and the president himself unwittingly escalated an ongoing conflict in which they looked worse and worse at every step. The suffragists' willingness to suffer again and again made the president look less like a champion of democracy abroad and more like a despot at home. Paul clearly understood this back-and-forth jiu-jitsu dynamic quite well when she spoke to reporters after being freed. "We hope that no more demonstrations will be necessary," she said. "But what we do depends entirely on what the administration does." Wilson seemed to have all the control, but ultimately it was the suffragists who forced the President of the United States down to the ground until he had no choice but to agree to their demands. The weak had transformed into the mighty. The suffragists didn't get their amendment right away. Though Wilson had finally agreed to endorse their cause, it would take some time before all of Congress fell in line behind him. The House of Representatives acted quickly, approving the 19th Amendment on January 10, 1918. But the Senate would take much longer. The women lobbied senators and kept the pressure on Wilson, who remained reluctant to become a consistent advocate for this change to the Constitution. The suffragists created new tactics to force the president's ongoing support, like lighting a fire in a Grecian urn in front of the White House and burning his words in it. There were additional arrests and trips to jail. By the end of their last protest, 500 women had been arrested and 186 sent to jail. On June 4th, 1919, the Senate finally followed the House's lead. The amendment then went to the state level for ratification. By the narrowest of margins, the Tennessee House of Representatives ratified the amendment on August 18, 1920, making it the 36th state to do so, the number necessary at that time to finally alter the U.S. Constitution. That episode in itself, the Tennessee episode, is fascinating, and it's written about in Roses and Radicals, which you should check out. That November, with the 19th Amendment now in place, millions upon millions of women, including Alice Paul, voted for the very first time. To be sure, Paul and the NWP cannot be given all the credit for this achievement. From 1913 to 1920, Carrie Chapman Catt and the NAWSA also worked tirelessly to advocate for women's suffrage. Thanks to their efforts, more than a dozen states amended their own laws to enfranchise women before 1920. Both organizations continued the long, slow process started 72 years earlier of convincing Americans that women deserve the right to vote, and this gradual change among the average citizen influenced the elected officials who represented them. Even though they were often at odds with one another when it came to strategy, NAWSA rejected all confrontational tactics, sticking instead to institutional methods like petitions and lobbying. The NWP needed NWSA and vice versa. Nevertheless, what seems undeniable is that the nonviolent struggle led by Alice Paul jump-started a stalled movement and accelerated the passage of a national amendment by many years. More than this, Paul's bold and courageous methods helped women not merely gain the vote, but reinvent the way they saw themselves as well. Just as Gandhi led his people toward a new and better view of Indian identity, independent and no longer submissive, so Paul propelled women to reconsider what it meant to be a woman in the first place. As two scholars put it, quote, Paul was trying to alter the prevailing view of women as weak, insufficiently educated, hysterical or temperamental, dependent on men, and not worthy of the vote. Instead of being hampered by actual limitations, Paul believed women were hampered by inaccurate views of their own capabilities. With a new sense of self-respect, they could achieve all. They could become American heroes. Paul showed that women could forge this new identity through nonviolent resistance. Winning the vote certainly mattered to her, but in truth, Paul's ambition extended to include something much greater, a reworking of femininity itself. Though sexism still remains a stubborn problem in today's America, women in this country can marry who they want, when they want, choose their own career path, live independently, and in a million ways, big and small, be precisely the kind of woman they want to be. Alice Paul and the suffragists hardly started this ongoing process, but it's undeniable they gave it a great and lasting push forward. By practicing nonviolent resistance, the silent sentinels demonstrated to a nation that quality these women had in themselves all along: boundless, steadfast strength. But would these same strategies work for those who weren't just dismissed as worthless, but were in fact virulently hated for the color of their skin? Could nonviolent activism prove that love really is stronger than hate? So obviously the next chapter is about Martin Luther King Jr. and Project C, the name of the campaign in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. This chapter is about how to fight when your opponent really hates you. Very briefly, before I sign off, here's the table of contents of the rest of the book. So we've read the introduction, the Gandhi chapter, the Alice Paul chapter. The next chapter is Martin Luther King Jr. and Project C. Chapter 4, Cesar Chavez and the Farm Workers Movement. Nonviolence is how to grow your side so you can win the fight. And then the 5th chapter, Václav Havel and the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Nonviolence is how to create a true democracy out of its exact opposite. And then, last but certainly not least, the conclusion of the book, nonviolence is how to fight today for a livable tomorrow. Greta Thunberg and the climate change movement. So thank you for listening to all these readings. I hope you enjoy it. Hope you're interested in reading more of the book. Please visit my website. There's going to be more content up there in the days and weeks to come. Bye-bye.